The French Revolution was one of the most influential periods in European history. It led to the rise of Napoleon, the decline of absolute monarchy, and the spread of revolutionary ideas across Europe. So let's start at the beginning with a brief overview of the causes of the revolution. France, in the late 18th century, was an absolute monarchy. The king had supreme authority, and the nobility and clergy were exempt from most taxes. However, the rising middle class or bourgeoisie resented this and wanted more political power. At the same time, France was in a severe financial crisis. The country had spent a lot of money on the American Revolution, and there was a growing gap between the rich and the poor. By 1789, things had reached a boiling point and the French Revolution began. The revolution began with the storming of the Bastille, a royal prison that had become a symbol of the monarchy's oppression. But the king kept going back on his word and didn't really want to share power. So in 1792, the National Assembly declared France a republic. The French Revolution was not just a change in government, it was also a change in the way people thought about society. The revolution gave rise to the idea of nationalism, which is the idea that people should be loyal to their nation rather than to a king. It also led to the end of feudalism in France and the abolition of slavery. Unfortunately, it also led to the Reign of Terror, a period of time when thousands of people were executed for opposing the revolution. The most famous victim of the Reign of Terror was King Louis XVI, who was executed in 1793. After the Reign of Terror, Napoleon Bonaparte came to power and eventually became Emperor of France. In 1814, Napoleon was defeated and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. But the French Revolution had changed France forever. Absolute monarchy was over, and France was never again ruled by a Bourbon king. Let's take a deeper look at each of these topics. To understand the French Revolution, it's important to know how France's government worked before the revolution. France was an absolute monarchy, which meant that the king had complete control over the government. The king was the head of the state, and he made all the laws. He was also the head of the church in France, and he controlled the Catholic Church there. France was divided into three groups or estates. The first estate was the clergy, and they made up about 1% of the population. They didn't have to pay taxes, and they held a lot of power because the king was the head of the church. The second estate was the nobility, and they made up about 2% of the population. Like the clergy, they didn't have to pay taxes, and they also had a lot of power. The third estate was everyone else, and they made up 97% of the population. The third estate was divided into three groups: the bourgeoisie, the peasants, and the urban workers. The bourgeoisie was the middle class, and they were educated and wealthy. But despite being wealthy, they didn't have any political power because all the power was held by the first and second estates. The peasants were the rural workers, and they made up about 80% of the population. They were very poor and they had to pay heavy taxes. The urban workers were the people who lived in cities and worked in factories or as servants. They were also very poor, and they lived in horrible conditions. The situation in France in the late 18th century was terrible. The country was in a severe financial crisis, and there was a lot of poverty. The American Revolution had been expensive for France, and the king had borrowed a lot of money to pay for it. To make matters worse, there was a bad harvest in 1788, and food prices went up. Things continued to get worse. In 1789, the people of France revolted. In 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate met and created a new group called the National Assembly. They wanted to create a constitution for France, and they wanted to end the absolute monarchy. On June 1789, the National Assembly took the tennis court oath The most famous victim of the Reign of Terror was King Louis XVI. Louis was born on August 27, 1755. He became king when he was only 5 years old. He was very unpopular as a king because he was indecisive and couldn't make up his mind. When the revolution began, Louis tried to escape France twice, but he was caught both times. He was brought back to Paris and tried for treason. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed on January 21st, 1793. Another famous victim of the Reign of Terror was Maximilien Robespierre was a leader of the revolution, and he was in charge of the Committee of Public Safety. This was the group that was responsible for the Reign of Terror. Eventually, Robespierre was executed by the guillotine on July 1794. The Reign of Terror ended with the fall of Robespierre. After the Reign of Terror ended, France was still in chaos. There were a lot of different groups fighting for power. In 1795, a group of radical Republicans wrote a new constitution for France. This ended the chaos and made France a dictatorship. The new government was called the Directory. It was led by 5 men, and they held all the power. The Directory was corrupt, and it didn't do a good job of running France. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte came to power and ended the Directory. Napoleon was born on August 15th, 1769. He was a general in the French army, and he rose to fame during the Italian campaign. He then led a group of military officers in a coup. This is a sudden and illegal seizure of power. Napoleon was named first consul of France, and he essentially became dictator of France. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. Napoleon ruled France like an absolute monarch. He did not believe in the ideas of the French Revolution, and he took away many of the rights that had been won during the Revolution. He also started a series of wars that spread the ideas of the French Revolution across Europe. Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, and he died on May 5th, 1821. After Napoleon was defeated, the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France. Louis XVIII became king, and he ruled until his death in 1824. After Louis XVIII died, his brother Charles X became king. Charles X tried to take away some of the rights that had been won during the French Revolution. The people of France revolted, and Charles X was forced to flee. This event is called the July Revolution. After Charles X fled, his nephew Louis Philippe became king. Louis Philippe was more liberal, and he respected the rights that had been won during the French Revolution. He ruled until 1848, when he was forced to flee during the February Revolution. The French Revolution was one of the most important events in European history. It led to the end of absolute monarchy in France and the spread of revolutionary ideas across Europe. It also led to the rise of Napoleon, who would have a huge impact on Europe in the early 19th century. If you want to learn more about the French Revolution, check out the resources below. And if you want to learn more about European history, stay tuned. Thanks for watching!